Welcome to part two. Now we're going to continue as we started with this age of exploration and this scientific revolution. And so one of the key things that comes up now is the concept of uniformitarianism. And it was James Hutton, who was a Scottish fellow who was making observations around Scotland and noticed some tilted rock that couldn't be explained by the theories of the time that had tried to incorporate observations that had been seen into that Bible doctrine or paradigm of the time. And that was that all rock layers and things like that had been laid down as sediment had settled out during Noah's flood. And he noticed some differences and he came up with some ideas, one of them being uniformitarianism that he wrote up in his book in 1795. Now, unfortunately for James, he had the idea, but he was not a very good communicator. And Charles Lyell picked up this idea and expanded upon it in his book in 1834. And it was based on the concept that the present is the key to the past. That's the key phrase, really, of this. And what it means is that basic processes that are operating now on the earth have remained constant through time. So if you can understand what you're observing now, you can understand what happened in the past to create the landscapes that you're seeing now, or the landforms or the rock forms. So it came out of geology. However, science does not take place in a vacuum. And that's what I've said here. And so those ideas are spreading around and fertilizing and being adopted by other disciplines. And so it was adopted by biology. And so they added that biologic processes now operating on the earth have always been operating and remained constant through time. And so if you can understand why you're seeing something like platypuses now, or a diversion of species like Darwin did on his voyage, then you can explain that. So it came from geology, but it was adopted by biological sciences as well. So I'm not sure why that line carried over there. The theory of evolution, coined by Darwin, was based on observations that he made that changes in domesticated animals and plants were actually natural processes, and that those same natural processes could cause wild animals and plants to change over evolutionary timescales. Certainly, domesticated plants and animals at that time, they knew how to breed particular animals and mix things together. Not maybe why it happened that way, but how you could get bigger horses or fruit that lasted longer and things like that. And so the diversity seen of Earth species could be explained by this uniform modification of genetic traits over long periods of time. And so that was Darwin's contribution. Now, there was another fellow, Lianis, who came up with a couple of things that are important. He developed a scheme of classification. As all of these diverse species were coming in, he developed a binomal scheme, so a two-named scheme that's still used today. And it classifies things and so that people can discuss them, differentiate between them, and study them. And so an example of his classification system would be what he calls, there we go, that's the classification system, what he named, why is that not working? Come on, give me back my pen. Here we go, Homo sapiens. So this was a term that he coined, and as you can see, it is binomal. And so we've got binomal means two names, so Homo and sapiens, to talk about humans, and to differentiate them from Homo neanderthalis, which were the Neanderthals. And then, of course, all plants and animals have scientific names, often with two this binomal system, one that classifies it as a larger classification and another that takes it down to species, really. And so that was his huge contribution to biogeography. Just as a side note, he and all of these other scientists who were working at the time were religious men. And so to kind of reconcile their religious beliefs with their scientific work, often they tried to adapt what they were seeing to what was said in the Bible. And so he tried to adapt the Bible doctrine to the observations he and others were making about the diversity of plants and animals on the earth, to by saying that Noah's Ark landed on this mountain in Turkey, and that this mountain in Turkey, Mount Ararat, and it's a really tall mountain near the border of Turkey and Armenia, that because it's so tall and it has this gradation of all these different types of species, so you have grasslands down here, you have forest here, you have alpine forest above that, and you get tree line and scrub brush above that. And so basically that all of the species from Noah's Ark disembarked here and were well adapted to living within all of these different climates that could be found on this mountain. And then they spread out all over the world to populate the world. And that's how he reconciled those things at the time. He was also, just to let you know, a very, or is said to be a very dynamic teacher, and he took his students out to on field trips, and he taught in universities for most of his career, and was a beloved instructor. That brings us to Alexander von Humboldt, and he is often credited as being the father of biogeography. And he was a very interesting fellow in that he studied things like the global patterns of plant communities. He put together in a holistic way that they were influenced by climate, elevation, atmospheric pressure, oceans, and soils. One of the things that he was rigorous about was using scientific instruments. And you can see here in this portrait of him that he has a barometer there. And so he always used cutting edge technology and took meticulous records of his measurements, and was dismayed if there was any problems with his instruments while he was out in the field. He was a contemporary of Darwin as well, and he's not only thought of as the father of biogeography, but also of volcanography, which is the study of volcanoes, anthropology, the study of man, meteorology, as you know, the study of weather, geomagnetism, which is amazing that he was the forefather of that as well, and oceanology. And you may have heard of Humboldt. There's a Humboldt current, or a current off of South America that's named after him. So the big thing of Humboldt is he brought understanding of the diversity of plants as you go from lower elevations to higher elevations, and built on some of the ideas that other people had of diversity going from the equator, being high at the equator, and getting lower as you move either towards the North Pole or the South Pole. He was integrative and a conceptual scientist. He invented isobars that connect areas of equal pressure, isotherms that connect lines of equal temperature, and he helped to visualize the climatic associations between plant communities. And this is an example from one of his books. It was first published way back in the 1600s. And this is looking at the Andes, Tenerife, the Himalayas, and the Alpine mountains, as well as Lapland. And you can see his zones of life. And so one thing that was very important to him was to be able to communicate his ideas, not just amongst other scientists and academics, but to lay people as well. And so this work is called A Physical Tableau of Mountain Ranges, and it's showing it the elevation bands in vegetation and the characteristics of the physical environment of these places. These early plant geographical drawings were done for other places as well, like in equatorial regions, and they describe these distinct bands of vegetation along these elevation gradients. And it's really these elevation gradients, as I mentioned, and the latitudinal gradients that he's best known for in biogeography. He also talked about, now he wasn't the first person to talk about this, and as you read in that article, he's not the first person to come up with these ideas, either from latitudinally or even vertically. But he thought about it more in kind of a niche concept. And so that was the new thing as well, that the species that occupied these areas occupied a specific niche in that community. And so that was one of his contributions as well. He's still celebrated as a scientist. And as I think I mentioned last week, I was able to sit in on a conference that was held because last week, starting at September 14th, was Alexander von Humboldt's 2051st birthday, or would have been. And they still have a conference in his name, and there's a whole journal that's dedicated to him. Or journal issue that's dedicated to him. So some of the big things that he brought in was, as I mentioned, he loved his instruments. So standardized instruments, but also measurement techniques. That he looked at the system as a whole and didn't break it apart into smaller pieces. He also included man in his studies and the impact of man on the environment. And so you can see in this circle here, we have the Anthropocene or the anthroposphere that's included in this, whereas a lot of scientists really up until recently didn't include man, and they tried to look at nature on its own separate from man, but he included man. That he put together these illustrations of this research to be able to communicate that more widely to a public audience as well as the academic audience. That he wanted to find a way to communicate those ideas for everyone, so it wasn't just rarefied knowledge. So he was interconnected and interdisciplinary, and he brought together the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the soil sphere or the pedosphere, as well as the biosphere all together, and brought everything together, including man, in his studies. And so that's a really interesting approach. And unusual at that time. And it's something that we're actually starting to get back to, that there was a period of time in the 70s, 80s, where we were moving away from that into more of, in the 60s, into more of a deterministic small view, and thinking if we could understand things separately in these small boxes, we could understand them in bigger areas. That we've dismissed now. The last thing that I'll say about Humboldt is that he, I don't know why I'm having such a problem getting my slides to advance. There we go. That he devoted the last part of his life to writing this opus, which was 5 volumes written in plain language. And the last one was published after his death. So the first 2 during his life, the last one based on his notes. And this was to appeal to the academics and public. And it was really important, as I said, that everybody understand and being able to understand what he's doing. And in this portrait here, he's actually holding one of the manuscripts for Cosmos in his hand. I'm going to stop it at there for part 2, and I'm going to pick up with Alfred Wallace when we come back together. So that's it for part 2.